Some of you who follow me on Facebook might know that over the years I've become very intrigued with a growing movement in our church to restore these weeks as weeks of Advent. Advent begins 2 weeks from today. Next week is Christ the King. But some of the parishes in our diocese, including our own cathedral, are celebrating Advent. And you might think to yourself, why is that? And I think one of the reasons why it is it is a counterpoint to those of us who go into CVS and Home Depot and the Big Y and see all of the Christmas ornaments and trees and even live poinsettia plants unfolding in front of us. I love Christmas, I love Santa Claus, but I also love Advent. And I know that in order to get to the season of joy and peace, that we need to take our time to get there. In the ancient church and in the Orthodox Church, this actually was a time of Advent. It was 7 weeks, not 4 weeks. And if you look at our readings over these weeks, they actually are Advent readings. They're readings that have as a theme of watching, waiting, preparing, being hopeful. So I'd like us to put that lens on, if for a moment, even though the oak leaves are just finally giving way and we haven't even got to Thanksgiving, and many of us are facing having to go home and rake the leaves that fell this week, to think about Advent, extending it a little bit longer than it normally is, particularly this year, and thinking about those themes: waiting, watching, preparing, hoping, and longing. Do those words mean anything different to us this year? I know for me they do. They do. I found myself frustrated with God, perhaps angry at God on a number of things this year, trying to work through that and be honest with God and be honest with myself. I've preached about having those issues around joy. Where's the joy in my life? Where's the joy in our community? Where's the joy in our church? In the midst of everything that is unfolding, where it's hard to find joy, where it's hard to find peace. This reading, again, is one of these typical Matthew readings. It gets understood and interpreted in different ways. Lots of televangelists and pastors use this gospel as proof positive that if you give and take and invest, you're going to be really, really wealthy. And I would argue that that is not what we ought to do with this particular gospel. That if we think about the master, I'm not entirely sure I want to cede the fact that the master in this story is really just a version of who Jesus is. Do we really want to have a version of Jesus that comes and takes the person who preserves a treasure, granted doesn't invest it, granted doesn't bank it, who then beats the person up? Jesus over and over and over again tells us that that is not the direction that Jesus is going in. So I would argue, let's not cede over to this parable that the master is really just an agent to tell us how Jesus is going to be. And so I want to back into this conversation a little bit with this. Have you ever panicked? Like really panicked? Been given something and thought, what am I going to do with this? how did this end up in my lap? Why did the person give me this? Now what do I do with it? Oftentimes when we have those experiences, we panic. We put it in our closet. We go into that kitchen drawer that nobody really wants to talk about, that seems to hold everything. So much stuff that you sometimes stick the saran wrap and the tinfoil on it to make it feel as if all the junk that's underneath is somehow not there. And you know one day will come when you'll clean it out. By the way, if you haven't cleaned out that drawer in 2020, I don't know when you're ever going to clean out that drawer. So you throw it in there. That's, I think, what happens to the servant. They panic. How much is a talent? A talent is 20 years' income. One talent. So 5 talents in this parable is 100 years' income. Imagine receiving $6 million or $3 million or $1 million. Most of us have never seen that type of money in one lump sum. There would be a tendency among some of us to panic. So, yes, part of me can understand why someone receiving $1 million would panic. And what happens? I'm going to bury it. That was a much more common response. Before there were closets and kitchen drawers and attics, I hate going into the attic, or basements, or garages that don't even hold cars, they just hold stuff. There was putting it into the ground. And that's what happens. Matthew's trying to evoke, I think, for us this image of sowing, right? So often we dig holes, and what do? We put in seeds. And when we put those seeds in, what happens? A plant comes, a tree comes, fruit comes, the seed comes. But there's also something else that you put into the ground. Death. You put death into the ground. And when you do that, what happens? It decomposes. It goes away. Out of sight, out of mind. God is in part talking to us, I think, in this parable about our panic. Recognizing and provoking our theological imagination and helping us to say, don't panic. But I understand when you do panic. The larger theme of this is really this theme of, I am going away from you. Jesus saying, I am going away from you. And I will come back. What will you do in my absence? What will you, my disciples, the soon-to-be church, do in my absence? This taps into this idea, which I think is the true centered purpose of this gospel, which is, I will give to you each talents. I will give to you each gifts. Some will have more, some will have less, some will have equal measure. You will be giving these things. And I ask you not to panic, but to take of them and to deploy them and to engage them and to put them of service of building up. So although this gospel is part about panic, I think it's also about risk. Because that to me is the opposite movement of panic. Once you realize you've been given something, whether you wanted it or not, once you realize that it has value and worth, then it's really fundamentally up to you to be able to steward that resource in such a way that it begins to grow and deepen. Even if it's as simple and as secure as taking that and dropping it down into the bank, bringing it over to Foxborough Federal or Rockland Trust, getting yourself a 6-month CD, do those things even exist anymore? And getting at least the interest. Then there's these other stories, these other reactions of being given gifts, unexpected and in high quality, and then to put them in service, to take risks, and in the risk-taking, to double them. Not an easy thing to do. But I have to tell you, I have a very interesting ministry at times. It allows me to see young people who come in before they get married. And oftentimes when you're sitting with them, they don't have a house. They are beginning to think about planning for a house. And then 2 or 3 years later, guess what happens? You get a phone call. We have a baby, and we'd like to have the baby baptized. And part of that process is sort of checking in with them to see, how are you doing on your goals? You don't say it like that. Do it much more subtly. And over time, what you realize is they've gone down the path. They've been able to put the money together. They have a house. Now they have a kid. Oftentimes they've finished off their education. Oftentimes they support one another as one is working, the other is getting an education. And within 2, 3, 5, 7 years, what they had has doubled. They formed a deep and loving relationship and commitment to double that. I have a really interesting ministry. I get to bury people. And if I'm lucky in that work, I actually get to meet the person as they begin to realize that they're slipping away from this life. Time and time again, I'm really awed and humbled by how people come into this world. And they do something that to me is very simple. The first is, I think they perfect that triangle, that relationship triangle. How do I come to know self, examine self, take care of self? How do I come and orient myself to others, my family, my friends, my community? And then how do I orient myself to God? Second thing, they embraced formation. They embraced education. The last person I buried from this church, she was part of that generation of nurses that said, I want to be of service to people. I want to be of service to others. And while it may not be entirely popular, at least it's a little bit more palatable for a woman to assert herself, as some folks, I think, so misogynistically say. And so she went to Children's Hospital and was educated and formed as a nurse. And by the time you see it working through, she's got a family, she's got her vocation, and her life has doubled. That's the meaning of this gospel, in my opinion. The meaning of this gospel isn't go give God $10,000 and some seed gift and suddenly you'll find yourself with $3 million, praise be Jesus. I've never gotten that. But I do get that idea of, God, who am I? who do you desire me to be? Who do I desire myself to be? How can I be of service for others? And when you do that work, as we wait for the Lord, as we're patient on the Lord, as we question God, as you encounter and bear that out, we can see that doubling. So I leave you with a couple of questions. Is there anywhere you're panicking in your life right now? Anything that you've been given that you think, why did I end up with this? I don't want it. Is there a way to take that panic and turn it into an awareness of, well, I might not want it, but here it is. How can I risk and put this of service to God? Second movement. What in your life has doubled? What has borne fruit? What is going well? We're about to hit Thanksgiving. That would be a great exercise to do before Thanksgiving comes. We know there's so many things that are not going right or well. But can we take a few minutes to lift up the things in our life where things have doubled, where growth has happened, life has happened, goodness has happened, and be thankful for God? And then lastly, I offer you this. Particularly as we bring this horrible year to an end, and may it come very swiftly. What is not going well for us? What's buried? What are we thinking about burying? And can we turn that around and say, God, I may have my moments of anger and doubt and frustration and pain, but I trust that you are there with us. I trust you are there with me. Just as the promise of Advent is that God is with us. Emmanuel, God dwelling with us as a fellow human being, both divine and human. Can I surrender that? And can you be the antidote to that death? Can you be the antidote to those places in my life that don't seem to be going so well? Can you be the antidote to those areas that I want to shove in the closet and shove in the second drawer of the kitchen cabinet under the tinfoil and saran wrap? God, can you be here with me? Be here with me. It takes courage and vulnerability to preach that. It takes courage and vulnerability to pray that. It takes courage and vulnerability for us to utter that. But it also takes humility and care in the season to lay back and say, once you utter those words, you better be willing to do two things. Wait and see and be patient. And two, to allow God to do something powerful with you. Amen?